And when you're trying to pull out the best in the folks that you're working with, you really have to find a way to connect with them and get them to believe in and buy into what you're doing and what you're trying to deliver. My thought is the best way of doing that is you tailor your approach based on the person you're working with. And so to do that, you really have to kind of make an effort to get to know somebody and have them get to know you and gain their trust and understand what makes John respond and what makes Jane respond. Having the awareness of understanding what will work and what won't work, I think is something that some people have and some people don't. And I think this goes back to, I might be going down the wrong path on this, but this goes back to people who are good leaders versus people who are really good individual contributors. I think people who are good leaders have this trait and have the emotional intelligence to know how to evoke responses out of people. And if you recognize that you have that, you can leverage it, and I think you can be really successful. The other aspect of governance is going to be making sure your data is ready to send into AI models, and it's only gonna make things worse if you're not prepared to do that. Buckle up, because I think the next 10 years with AI is going to be really interesting.
Guest today is the former CIO of Serco North America. Fantastic technology leader, and I really enjoyed that conversation with Chris.
Yeah, what stood out to me was the story he told us where they found the threat actor in their environment that was hiding there for quite a while, and just hearing how his company handled it and getting the FBI involved. That was a very insightful story. So let's jump into it and hear more from Chris.
That's how you got rolling, basically, from the computer labs at JMU to AT&T. And what was your first your main break? Where you okay, now your trajectory was starting to move forward at a faster rate.
I remember this one specifically. I might have even told you this story before, Bob. I don't know, but so I started at AT&T in August of '87, and I started off as a COBOL programmer. Then AT&T started moving away from mainframes and more towards distributed systems. So I got a C and a C++ programming certificate, and we were writing software for these distributed systems. But there were still some that were using dumb terminals and some that were using PCs with emulators on them. And then around the mid 90s, so it was probably like 7 years into my career, a couple things happened. First, I knew I started actually becoming more of a team leader. There were managers and senior managers and district managers, and the managers had team leaders underneath them. Each team leader had, I don't know, anywhere from 6 or 8 people working for them. And so I started, I knew I didn't want to be writing software heads down in my cube for the next 20 years. And so I started gravitating towards kind of being a team leader. And the other big thing that happened at that time is AT&T made a push to really move away completely from mainframes and started deploying PCs to all employees. And the dumb terminals were being removed and PCs were being added. And as the PCs were being added, that required certain things. It required more sophisticated local area networks. It required user authentication. And then so that was where things like NT domains were introduced and things like that. And so I remember one day I was called into my district manager's office, and he said, Chris, we're putting together a new team. I think he called it like the LAN management team or LAN operations team, and I want you to run it. I didn't, when he said, I don't think I even knew what LAN meant at the time. And I just knew it wasn't anything that I knew anything about. The reaction was, I don't want anything to do with that. That sounds like something where I'm just going to be pushed off to the side. And I was like, I don't think I really want to do that. And he said, well, he goes, this is really important. He goes, go home tonight and think about it. come back to my office tomorrow morning and let's talk about it again. So I went home that night, talked to my wife about it, and I didn't really come to any different conclusions. Understand the primary reason behind me being kind of so adverse to taking this over. I knew who I'd be working for, and I liked them. I knew the people I'd be working with. We all got along. It was really pushing me out of my comfort zone into something that I didn't know anything about. I was managing people who were writing software and executing test plans and things like that. And now PCs and LANs. I knew how to turn my PC on and log in and open up the compiler and do that kind of stuff, but I didn't know anything else beyond that. So I went back into his office the next morning and said, yeah, I really don't think it's for me. I'm really not interested. And I remember he kind of sat back in his chair and looked up the ceiling and then took a deep breath and leaned forward and said, he goes, I really need you to do this job. He goes, you need to do this job for me. And he was kind of saying, I'm not really asking. And so he said, but I'm a little concerned now because I'm worried that you're not going to do it to the best of your abilities because you don't want to do it. He goes, just if you work with me and give it a shot, he goes, I promise you, it's critical to our success. If the LAN and the PCs and all that stuff aren't working, we're not going to be able to deliver our software, and we're not going to make our deliverables, and we're not going to be successful as a district. And so I told him, I said, I'm really not sure this is for me, but I will give it a shot and do it to the best of my abilities. And I said, okay, so I agreed. And that's how I started getting my first exposure to Microsoft and NT domains. Tyler, you're probably too young for this, but it was the Microsoft Mail was the precursor to Exchange and user authentication and things like that. And that's where I first got exposed to local area networks, firewalls and routers and switches and IT security wasn't really being talked about then beyond user authentication and stuff like that. Everybody had their password written down and posted up on their terminal. The IT security wasn't what it is today, but that's what really first started exposing me to the infrastructure side of technology. Whereas up to this point, it was more of the mainframes and software and stuff like that. And so had I not made that pivot put me on a trajectory where over the next several years I had successive promotions and new roles that moved me further and further up the management chain in that technology space. And that was really kind of the moment that fundamentally changed my career path. If I had not done that, I'm not sure what I'd be doing right now, to be honest with you.
So basically, if you had not embraced the discomfort of going, shifting from basically an application development role to an infrastructure role, right? You might have just kept, doing the same thing for a number of years and not have gotten those experiences.
Or I probably would have stayed in some kind of management role somewhere, but I don't know if it would have been in the software development field. Who knows? I might have been,
right,
managing a car dealer or something like that. I knew I wanted to manage people, and I thought I was doing an okay job with it. I think they thought I was doing an okay job with it, and that's one of the reasons why I was asked to kind of manage this new team. Managing technical people I've always said that managing technical people is probably a little different from managing non-technical people, only because technical people, we've all run across, a brilliant technologist who is probably the smartest person in the room, but that level of intelligence comes with some complexities of trying to pull out the best in them and ensure that they're collaborating and sharing and things like that. It's a little different animal, I kind of think, managing technical people versus non-technical people, and I kind of felt like I did that fairly well.
Chris, I did have one question I wanted to ask on this, kind of outside of any formal training that you've had. Are there any kind of skills that you developed that proved crucial through your journey here?
There's one skill that I've always told people: if you can develop it, develop it. And I've been really fortunate where I've had a lot of really good formal training at some really, really quality institutions, and including Harvard Business School and the Said School of Business at Oxford and George Washington University and things like that. And there you learn really interesting, management and leadership concepts, and that's all really good. But the one skill that I think I've developed, and Bob, you and I worked together for a while. You can tell me if you agree. But the one skill that I feel like I really developed is I never ever thought you could use a one size fits all management approach with people. For the reasons I was just talking about a minute ago, people are different. They have different personalities. And if you try to use a one size fits all approach with everybody, it's not gonna, I don't think it works very well. There's some people that will respond to a particular style, and there's some people that won't. And when you're trying to pull out the best in the folks that you're working with, you really have to find a way to connect with them and get them to believe in buy into what you're doing and what you're trying to deliver. And my thought is the best way of doing that is you tailor your approach based on the person you're working with. And so to do that, you really have to kind of make an effort to get to know somebody and have them get to know you and gain their trust and understand what makes John respond and what makes Jane respond, and then the real key is the glue of trying to put it together, where you use one approach with John and one approach with Jane, and then you bring them together and you try to integrate that so that John and Jane are working well together. And everybody has a different personality. And I've worked with managers who try a one size fits all, and I've seen it fail miserably. They're half the team will really respond, and the other half of the team is totally disengaged. Finding that balance of how to get everybody engaged, I think, is really the key. And a lot of that has to do with not technology. It's personality and management traits of being able to personalize your relationship with somebody so they can kind of believe in what we're doing. You have to get them to buy into it. That's probably the biggest thing I've always kind of fell back on in terms of, if you want to be a successful manager, you have to really learn how to do that.
Curious of we're kind of talking about the times when you're coming up. This is well before YouTube. Now in 2025, you've got certifications, you've got videos, all kinds of stuff to learn these kind of things on the sides. Back earlier on, in the 80s and 90s, was there any maybe mentor that you kind of picked up some of these strategies from? Any books that really stood out to you? Or is this kind of trial and error? You tried and saw what worked and kind of built your approach off of that?
You're right. Back in the 80s and 90s, they didn't have the things that people have today. I think that's a very personal question. When what I mean by that it's not an offensive question, but it's different for everybody. And for me, I think the first real mentor that I gravitated to was probably in the late 80s. There was a brilliant individual contributor, and he recognized what he was good at and what he wasn't good at. And he was great at technology and wasn't so great at managing people. And so I was paired up with him. This was a couple of years after I took over that land team, and I was paired up with him because I was kind of seen as somebody who could manage technical people, and he was seen as a subject matter expert that was really good at getting this stuff together, and we worked really well together. And so he kind of became my first formal mentor, I should say. We became friends, and for, I guess, from like 97, I took a role over where I was managing a team that, this was back in the day where Microsoft had a domain model called a multiple master domain model. And basically we had several NT domains across the AT&T Business Enterprise, and across different divisions, and we plugged them all together. And so I had kind of moved up to manage a team that was managing that enterprise, and it was a brand new architecture that was being deployed. And so he was a really good mentor of mine from a technology perspective. Maybe I don't know if he used me as a mentor from a management or a leadership perspective, because we both kind of knew our swim lanes. But I knew that if I wanted to be a successful manager, I needed to really understand the technology. And at the time, there were books and there were classes, but I always kind of felt that the best learning I did was, through the school of hard knocks, so to speak, on the job, where you're kind of really learning from real world experiences. And so that was the first big thing in terms of me really kind of attaching myself to somebody and learning from them. And again, that in and of itself had a lot to do uh, with my career path. That's when I started getting really good at that Microsoft model, uh, and I learned all of that from him. And so, the mentoring aspects of learning on the job, I think, are invaluable. And companies that put together formal and informal mentoring programs, I think, are really smart to do that. Some people like it, some people don't. But for me, it worked out really well.
Chris, you had talked about using different management styles for different people, basically understanding what makes each person ticks, and and basically tailoring your approach for each individual. And you didn't use this term, but this term gets thrown around a lot as emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And I think what you are, saying is, hey, it took some development of emotional intelligence for you to tailor your approach for each of the whether it be team leaders or when I saw you, when I worked with you, it was the vice presidents reporting to you on your
Yeah.
team. Talk to me about that tailoring approach.
That's I don't think that, I think people that are good at that, it's not something you can read a book and be good at that. I think that's a personality trait. And having the awareness of understanding what will work and what won't work, I think is something that some people have and some people don't. And I think this goes back to, I might be going down the wrong path on this, but this goes back to, people who are good leaders versus people who are really good individual contributors. I think people who are good leaders have this trait and have the emotional intelligence to know how to evoke responses out of people. And if you recognize that you have that, you can leverage it, and I think you can be really successful. On the other hand, if you recognize that you don't have that, maybe that's how you set yourself apart as a really good individual contributor who's brilliant. I mean, there are I can probably count on two hands the number of people that I've run across who are, in my opinion, light years more intelligent than I'll ever be, but just didn't possess that trait to be able to manage people. And I think they recognize that, and some recognized it better than others, and so they kind of stick to their swim lane, which is being a particular subject matter expert in a particular area that will, lead to architecting or setting the path or the groundwork for, where you want to be technology wise. It's a emotional intelligence, I think, is a really important skill that I think some people have and some people don't. If you have it, there's probably ways you can take some training to improve upon how to use it. But it's hard to. I think it's hard if you don't have that. It's hard to kind of really develop that. It's really tied to your personality.
So you talked about how you started to grow your career, right? And you talked about your first big break, which was running that LAN team. And then you talked about, a mentor that was really strong from a technology subject matter expertise. So, what about some of the big challenges that you faced in your career journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. In my 35 years, I've seen all the challenges that one would come across as they eventually make their way to a C-level leadership style. Everybody kind of faces, personnel challenges and conflict resolution challenges and budget cuts and layoffs and failed implementations and failed backouts if you're on the technology side, those types of challenges. But probably the biggest challenge that sticks out when somebody asks me that question is it was in probably 2015. It was mid-December of 2015. I remember my CISO walked into my office and said, I just got a call from Special Agent so-and-so from the FBI, and our network is owned by a nation state. They have evidence of data being exfiltrated out of our network, going to a collection point for a nation state that they've been sitting on for quite a while. And I remember not really comprehending what he was saying at the time. And he was panicking, and I was starting to panic. And the reason this was such a challenge for me, I'd never been exposed to a cyber incursion like this before, or a cyber attack. And, it's funny, a couple of years after this, I'll tell you a quick story. A couple of years after this, I had the opportunity to have dinner with Tony Scott. Tony Scott was the CIO of Microsoft from about 2007 or 8 until about 2013, or I think 2013. He was there when they spent $8 billion on Skype. But I had dinner with him, and at the time he had left Microsoft, and he was now the federal CIO, which he was in that role from like 2015 to 2017. And myself and about 7 or 8 other CIOs had the opportunity to have dinner with him. And he said something then that made me laugh. He said, there's 2 types of CIOs in the government space and the government contracting space, and probably across most industries. There are those CIOs who have identified and lived through cyber attacks, and there are those CIOs who have been attacked and don't yet know about it. And 2 years prior to that, when my CISO walked in and said, we have been we weren't under attack. We had been infiltrated, and the nation state was now starting to exfiltrate data. So that kicked off a whole series of things. I remember the first thing was I stood up and went down the hall to the CEO's office, my boss, CISO, and first thing he did was he dragged in the general counsel, and we were all kind of dumbfounded. And at the time, my CISO was a really, really, really good CISO. I have a lot of respect, had a lot of respect for him. Unfortunately, he had passed away a year or 2 ago, which was really sad. But at the time, he was brilliant. And he said, okay, I know what we need to do. We need to call in a cybersecurity firm and help us get a handle on this, which we did. And the reason it was so uncomfortable is the difference between a nation state attack and, say, a criminal organization is a criminal organization will come in and they'll just encrypt everything and hold it for ransom and want you to pay a large sum of money. A nation state sneaks their way in without you knowing, hides in the corners of your network, and sits and watches and looks and starts feeling around in the background to find out where all your crown jewels are, and then they start taking them and exfilling them out. And so with a nation state, the hard part is figuring out where they are, what servers have they compromised, where are they hiding, what network devices, et cetera, et cetera. Tom, I'm sure this is old hat for you. And back then it probably took us a good 6 weeks working with this firm to really understand them. And so all this time I had to work, and nobody else in the company knew about it. There was maybe 5 people in the entire company that knew this was going on. We had to keep it a secret. And so working while a bad actor is lurking in your network looking for stuff is a very uncomfortable place to be. And we had to do that for, say, 2 months. But we spent hours and hours over this from mid-December to mid-February. We were working in ungodly hours, putting a plan together, then building. We would build new servers and new network devices, and anything that was where we found an infection, or where the bad actor had embedded some of their Trojans. We replicated that server offline. Couldn't do anything online, because if the bad actor saw you doing it, they know you were on them, and they would go figure out other places to hide. So you had to do it in a way where they couldn't detect you, which meant everything had to be done offline. And then one weekend, I think we did it over President's Day weekend in mid-February, because it was a 3-day weekend. We didn't tell anybody about it, but like at 4:45 that Friday afternoon, a note came out from the CEO saying the network is going to be shut off in 15 minutes, and it's not coming back on again until Monday morning. And it came out from the CEO, obviously, because if I had sent it out, every business leader would have in the building and across the company would have been in my office. And so we shut the network off, and then we had that remediation weekend, we called it, and guys worked around the clock replacing servers and cleaning data and doing all the things we had to do. And the uncomfortableness and the reason this was so difficult was I never quite felt 100% sure that we got it all. It wasn't until after we came back up Monday morning and the firm we were working with and the FBI continued to watch our network to see if there was any evidence of it. And, after about 5 or 6 days, we were pretty comfortable based on the feedback we got from this firm and the FBI that we had successfully remediated and cleaned the network. But it was 2 months of sheer discomfort. I remember that Christmas and New Year's, that holiday, it was no rest for the weary. And I was on pins and needles the whole time. And, the thing that I was worried about the most was, seeing, on the front page of the Washington Post, Serco CIO responsible for, cyber tech on, shutting down the company. It was an uncomfortable place to be. After the fact, the FBI and the cyber firm we were working with said, it looks like they had broke into the network and started embedding themselves 6 months before I'd actually joined the company. So they had been there for a while. And we had dodged, without getting into the gory details, they never exfiltrated any real sensitive data. They took some data, but it was kind of old, benign data that was really, really old. So we really dodged a bullet, but that was a really uncomfortable time for me. And that was kind of a growing up point. And from that point on, the big lesson learned for that, up to that point, the thought around cybersecurity was, well, let's design our cybersecurity controls and tools around things that'll be convenient for the end user. Starting that day, we were like, okay, we are now going to design our controls around what's effective. And if it's a little less convenient for the end user, so be it. And that really that was a pivotal moment for Serco North America and probably Serco globally, because we worked really closely with the global CISO and global CIO. And it really opened everybody's eyes on, okay, we have to take this seriously. We have to fund cyber properly. We have to put the right tools in place. We have to put the right people in place that can run the tools. And it was, in the long run, it helped Serco greatly become much more cyber aware and cyber ready. But it was a really uncomfortable place to be. That was, so a challenge of having to reduce staff by 20%, or a challenge of trying to roll out a new HR system and have it fail miserably. Those things are really uncomfortable, but from my perspective, and I've been through those, this was the most uncomfortable and the biggest challenge I can remember facing.
Wow. Yeah, that's an incredible story, Chris. And talk to me about some of the conversations that you had to have with your team, right? To basically organize them, getting going in the right direction and aligning them towards, the goal, the outcome that you wanted to.
Yeah. The reason that worked out so well had a lot less to do with me and a lot more to do with the fact that I had really good people on my team, which has kind of been another one of my mantras that I've kind of lived by during my career. Not only do you have to have that emotional intelligence to know how to manage people, I made it a point to try to make sure I hired the best and the brightest folks, because I certainly didn't know all the answers, and I needed to hire people that knew the answers. And so I had a great CISO, I had a great IT operations guy, and they were really good at motivating their teams, and everybody understood the seriousness of it. Because when you're sitting in a conference room with the FBI and people from the Air Force, if you want to find the really badass cybersecurity guys, the Air Force has them. They have some really good, really smart cybersecurity guys. And when you're sitting in a room with those guys, the level of urgency is definitely known by all. And so everybody kind of grabbed onto it. It didn't help the fact that we actually feel like we found the point of origin where the first hole that the nation state used to break in. And it was one of the system admins who had admin control over servers, and they had done something they shouldn't have done, and they were exploited, and their ID, basically it was a credential stealing exercise where the nation state stole the admin level credentials, and that gave them keys to the kingdom, and they started rooting around everywhere. And so we had really good people that were able to kind of compartmentalize, say, okay, look, and the first task is focus on identifying what we need to clean. Where are the bad actors? And once we got past that, it was okay. Now let's manage and come up with a project plan for the cutover weekend where we were going to remediate everything. And then once we got past that, then it was a focus on, okay, now we've got to really get serious about how we're doing cybersecurity. And it was almost an instantaneous change across the teams. And we didn't have any pushback from anybody, because there was a lot of really well-respected technology and leaders and managers of those technology teams that got their teams to respond well. And we really kind of turned the corner in terms of the awareness that was necessary to do that. But had it not been for a really good CISO and a really good head of IT operations, we wouldn't have been that successful.
Unfortunately,
Wow.
that's very, very common where you'll have, I've seen it firsthand, a lot of different companies will not have, it's like pulling teeth to get a cybersecurity budget until either a competitor or they are attacked. And then it's like just a sudden influx of cash to get the problem handled and taken care of. I'm kind of curious, Chris, um, if when you're talking with non-technical stakeholders, how do you ensure to convey the, need for like a cybersecurity budget to be able to ensure the
Yeah.
organization's protected? How do you convey that to them?
Yeah, it was easier for me because I think my CEO at the time also had a wake up call. It was for all of us, and had it just been me um, um, trying to debate with the CFO that I needed a certain amount of money for cyber, I may not have been as successful. But the CEO of North America, and in turn the CEO and CISO of global Serco, made it well known that we need to properly fund this, because tools cost money. And you can't just buy a tool and implement it and expect it to work. You have to have the labor to be able to run the tool as well, and it costs money. And unless you're willing to do that, you run the risk of being barred from doing work with the federal government. And this was before CMMC, but when you get the reputation out there of being a company that doesn't take its cybersecurity for granted, especially if you're a company that handles sensitive information. And I want to make sure I'm clear on something. We were not a classified. This was not a classified network. This was an unclassified network, but we had what's called controlled unclassified information. And when you take enough pieces of controlled unclassified information that are somewhat relatable and put them all together, it can now make a piece of classified information. And so we had discussions with the business leaders to say, look, this is not a nice to have. This is table stakes now if we want to stay in business. Till the day I left, there were still people that were lower down in the ranks that kind of pushed back against that. And to be honest with you, by the time I retired at the end of 2022, there was enough new business leaders in the company, either through acquisition or just from hiring, that they didn't live through that. Anybody who lived through that, we never got pushback from. But for the new folks that kind of came on board, there was always pushback, and there was always people that were doing things to try to circumvent our security controls, or complaining about the controls we put in place because it makes it harder for them. They can't print to their local printer at home because we don't allow split tunneling or something like that. People were always complaining, but at the end of the day, the top-down leadership support that I had helped ensure that we had the right tools. Now, there were times when I wish I had more money to spend on cyber and more people to support cyber, but what we ended up with was certainly light years better than where we were back in 2015 when this whole thing happened. So I think without that top-down approach and buy-in from the executive team, it would be really hard for somebody to be successful in terms of trying to change the culture of a company. Because the one thing, and Bob and I both worked for a CEO after the one that was in place after he retired, a new CEO came in who was as adamant about cybersecurity that as anybody, and he really supported us in that regard, and he knew that we're only as good as the employee at some remote office in the Midwest that gets an email with a link and clicks on it when they shouldn't have because they didn't pay enough attention and thinking they got an email from HR saying they're being given a bonus and click here to collect your bonus. I mean, it's crazy to think that even with all the tools and technology, it's you're still only as good as the people out in the field recognizing when they're getting fished.
So, Chris, I want to get your view on kind of the rise of AI, both
Yeah.
as a threat and as a tool. I'm sure you've seen it, from when you got
Yeah.
into IT in the 80s, kind of seeing AI machine learning advance. What kind of tell us what you're seeing, what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I don't think, well, let me say it different. I think the majority of the people in the world today don't have the level of understanding of how AI is going to change people's lives. So I'm talking beyond business. I think AI is going to be both a disruptor and a huge opportunity. It's incredible. Just in the time that Bob and I have been exposed to AI. When I retired at the end of 2022, I think the first release of ChatGPT came out the month before. And I think about in the last 2.5 years since then, I mean, we're at what, 4.0 or 4 Omni is the latest version of ChatGPT that's out there and the various models that exist. And, you can buy different level. You can use the free model or you can pay for different things. And there's all kinds of things that AI is doing. But I think it's going to serve as both a disruptor and create huge opportunities. I'm reading a book. I'm halfway through a book right now called Genesis. It was written by three guys. Henry Kissinger, first of all. It was the last book he was writing before he passed away a year or so ago. And he's described in the book. He's like the elder statesman of all elder statesmen. And the reason he was really diving into AI wasn't because he's a technologist. He was worried about the impact AI could have. It's kind of like back in the dawn of the nuclear age. He was really worried about what could happen in the world if nuclear energy or nuclear weaponry didn't have the proper governances around it. And he saw this was starting several years ago. He saw the potential of AI and the fact that it could be both really, really good and also really, really bad if we don't have proper types of governance around it. But Henry Kissinger, Eric Schmidt, who's the former chairman and CEO of Google, and a guy named Craig Mundy, who I think he had a role at Microsoft where I think he was the chief research officer and chief strategy officer at Microsoft. They wrote this book with Henry Kissinger. I think they kind of finished it after he passed away. And when I started the book, I was expecting it to talk about pretty, what you would think pretty common themes of, okay, how's AI gonna impact us, and what is the power of AI? But it's getting into real rise of the machine stuff. There's a theory that they put up in the book that says, the humanity and our world has become so complex that we're kind of hitting the upper limits of what a human brain can comprehend, the level of intelligence, and that any major transformational discoveries moving forward are going to be made in combination with a human leveraging really, really powerful AI models. And the thought about that and the potential of whether the AI models will be used for good or bad. They explore some really interesting thoughts in this book, and it's like I said, I'm halfway through it, but it's kind of making me think about AI in a way that I had not thought about in terms of these models and their ability to process and comprehend and interpret and relate massive, massive, massive quantities of data and then produce a result is something that basically the human brain would never be able to do without AI. So it's actually it's exciting, but it's also scary. I think there's going to be a need for some type of governance. What that is, I don't know, because based on what you read and what you hear, the potential is there for AI to be hugely transformational for society. It's thinking about what using AI in business to make business more efficient because it can help with processing 100 resumes to pick out the 5 best ones. That's really kind of little league, low hanging fruit stuff for AI, and that's something that's in place today. They're talking about models that could potentially challenge human thought, and so it's the potential's there for it to be really scary if you buy into that. And there's a lot of folks out there that are very secure in the fact that they feel that the proper governance controls will be put around AI so that doesn't happen. But it's you think about real world scenarios. With the headline of the news this morning, this morning was the Israelis attacking Iran because Iran's developing a nuclear capability that they don't want them to have, and they don't think it's safe for them to have. And nuclear capabilities have been around humanity and society for a long time. Since Oppenheimer developed the first bomb, and Iran's now catching up and with the potential of developing their own. Well, think about the same thing with regard to an AI model, and an AI model that could influence policy decisions or things like that. And there's a lot of really disruptive stuff that a really sophisticated set of models could do with the right data that, if they're not controlled, have the potential of being pretty catastrophic. So I'm not an AI naysayer. I think AI is great. I think we should embrace it. But until I started reading this book, I really wasn't thinking about that side of AI and how it really has the ability to drastically change things. A lot of people talk about AI can help solve things like climate change or come up with cures or treatments for disease and things like that. But this goes even beyond that. They kind of put that aside to say, yeah, that's the little league stuff of AI. There's some really, really major stuff that people are thinking about AI that most folks haven't really kind of thought about yet. So from that regard, it's going to have a huge impact, I think, on business in general. But it's going to have even bigger impact on, I think, how people live.
Definitely. If I could make 2 recommendations, The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil is a good read. Also, I'm right in the middle of The Coming Wave by Mustafa. I can't remember his last name, but both of those kind of talk a lot about what AI could possibly be, and they're very interesting reads. So, highly recommend those if that's something you're interested in.
Absolutely, I would love to. Once I finish this one, not that I'm trying to plug this book, but it's whenever I have a free moment, it's not at all what I expected when I started reading. But as I started reading, I was kind of like having these oh shit moments, and then thinking,
Yes.
well, yeah, I guess that is pretty thought provoking.
Definitely. So you kind of mentioned ChatGPT. I'm curious, are there any other AI tools that maybe you use either weekly, on the daily, benefits that you see from those tools?
Yeah, I in my capacity now as a retired guy, I use kind of like the household versions of ChatGPT in terms of, like, it's funny. Here's a great example. My wife and I are currently in the process of selling our house. And a lot of people come in and they say, man, we want to put a pool in the backyard, but we don't know how we would do that because I have a little bit of a slope in my backyard. So I took a picture of my backyard and I threw it into ChatGPT and I said, hey, generate a picture of a pool built into the side of the hill with a stone wall, retaining wall that matches my fire, and it spit out this beautiful picture. And so I gave that to my wife and I said, when you have open houses, put this down and say, this is the potential. And that's like saying I can use ChatGPT to help me generate my grocery list each week. It's kind of low hanging fruit, but it's just sitting around the house in terms of what I'm doing now. I can only imagine, talking with people who are still working in industry, how they're using AI. it's become, I think there's a lot of people using AI that aren't realizing they're using AI. You buy a new ERP system and there's AI models built into them. You buy a new AP workflow tool and there's AI models built into them, and they just don't know it. It's kind of like a no-brainer these days that people don't even realize that they're using it. But for me, in my capacity now outside of industry, I still like to dabble a little bit and do stuff like that with AI. And I've used it to like generate like letters and things like that. Like I'll write something and put it in and say, hey, rewrite this, the easy stuff. But if I was working right now, um, I would really be looking for ways to drive efficiency in my business with AI. But and that in and of itself is going to bring challenges, right? Because I think for AI tools to be effective in a company, the company has to be ready to receive the AI tools, and that means you have to take business people and have them really understand AI models, and you have to take technology people and have them really understand business. And AI is only as good as the data you're pumping through it, right? And so if your data is really dirty and messy, then you necessarily won't have as successful of an experience. And the risk you run is the business will kind of look at AI as kind of a science experiment that either did or didn't work. But how's it going to really help me win the next contract? That's what they're going to be thinking. And so those are really challenging things, I think, that technology folks have to really kind of partner up with the business to deliver AI tools that really generate an ROI. I'm sure it's not easy. I'm not envious for people that are in those situations because they're gonna bump up against the cultural aspects of a company that has been using legacy systems forever, and trying to get them to change how they do things and trying to get AI models to integrate with legacy systems is going to be really challenging, and it's going to cost some money. And unless they plan it right, it's going to be looked at as a black hole that we dumped a lot of money into and got nothing out of. And so it's got to be carefully thought out.
Yeah, you said a couple of things that I'd like to ping on. So first of all, you mentioned that people are not likely to realize how ubiquitous AI is going to be, right? Yeah. And for all of us today, it's now becoming ubiquitous, right?
Yeah.
And then the second thing, and this one goes back, and perhaps it connects into the cybersecurity discussion that we had a little earlier, but implementing AI within an organization requires a level of governance, I think, that most organizations aren't ready for, right? Yeah. When you're talking, I mean, we talked about the cybersecurity issue that you dealt with very effectively, right? But now if you're going to put AI in, you've really got to ring fence that solution, and allow certain data to come in and certain data to go out. But that requires a different level of sophistication from a governance standpoint that we have today. Yeah.
And governance is a broad term, right? And if you break down what that governance includes, it's not an easy task, and it's going to really require some dedication from leadership top down, because we've all run across guys that have been in the job and are really good at what they do, but they like doing things the way they've been doing them for the last 10, 20 years, and they're not necessarily open to changing how they do things. And that's the cultural war that you're gonna get into. And that's just one aspect of it. The other aspect of governance is going to be making sure your data is ready to send into AI models, and it's only gonna make things worse if you're not prepared to do that. If you're gonna, like I said, you're gonna be looked at as somebody who spent a lot of money on the latest whiz bang thing that isn't really doing a whole lot for me and my job. Is what would happen if you don't have that level of governance. But I actually I was listening to a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and you talked about how AI is going to be so ubiquitous. One guy kind of drew an analogy back to prior to email, how did businesses work? We've gone through this evolution of communications where we were at a point where everything was done by telephone and there was no email. And then we got to a point where email rolled out and then everything was done by email. And then we got to a point where email was looked at as kind of a hindrance. And people have moved on to chat platforms and other things because email just bogs you down. I mean, you think about how ubiquitous email was for a while in terms of business, and people didn't even think twice about it. He kind of drew a correlation with AI models. You're going to get to a point now where you're not going to think about how would you do your job without it. It's going to be so ingrained.
I do want to kind of ask a question off of what you just said there, Chris. You firsthand kind of got to see some of the latest developments, big developments in tech with the dot-com boom, and people not wanting to jump on that bandwagon and get websites or emails, and then kind of again in the early 2000s with smartphones, people wanted to keep their old flip phone. Now everybody's got a smartphone. I feel like we're going through that again with AI. So I'm curious, since you saw both of those firsthand, are there any similarities maybe you're seeing from both of those times as opposed to kind of AI becoming really big now, that could maybe help provide some insight to our listeners?
I think so. We're just touching on a little bit, right? In order to get people to really understand and accept AI, you've really got to demonstrate its value to them. Whether you're a business development person or you're a business operations person or you're an HR person or a finance person or something like that, unless you can kind of show value and how it's going to make their job better, it's going to be very difficult to kind of win that cultural war. I'll give you an example of a real world example that Bob and I lived through back at Serco. We had a particular contract that we won with Centers for Medicare and Medicaid with the government with helping support Obamacare. We won a contract back in 2013, and the contract evolved into something where we were adjudicating insurance applications that were submitted through the federal marketplace. When that contract started, during open enrollment, that was the heavy time. We had I think at our peak, we had 4 different centers where we would hire 3,000 people per center to work shifts to kind of adjudicate insurance application. When I say adjudicate, I mean people submit an application for insurance through the federal marketplace. And if there was a problem with that application, it would fall to us to resolve and adjudicate and fix. Whether it's, I have 2 dependents when you really only have 3, or you said I make X number of dollars when you really make Y, that kind of stuff. And all of those applications, when they had an issue, fell into our tool, and we had people sitting behind a computer, and they had a stack of federal insurance policy manuals, this thick, that they had to read through. And you can imagine, these were hourly waged folks that were kind of trained on this, but invariably, when you could have 2 people sitting next to each other and they're reading an application and they're trying to apply these insurance policies against the application, and 2 different people sitting next to each other can read the exact same type of application and interpret the policy differently and have 2 different outcomes in the same application where they should have been the same. Well, one of the benefits Bob and I had is there was a brilliant architect. He's still out in the business now, and I'm sure he's helping people a lot. I know he helped Serco. He put together a team where they created robots. They created AI models that were able to automate the processing of those applications, so much so that headcount shrank. I wouldn't say it's probably, I don't know, Bob, 70 or 80% from when we started to where we ended up. So we had a fraction of the people doing it, which was great because it was a lot cheaper for the customer, and we had better outcomes. We were able to process applications faster. We had more consistent outcomes, and we're able to get people insured quicker based on the use of this AI. And when it was first being deployed, there was a lot of naysayers. There was a lot of people that didn't believe it was going to do what it was going to do. but it did, and people, it showed people the value that it provided. It showed it to the customer, and it showed it to the leadership of Serco that really kind of bought into it. Then it's going to be something similar to that. I think that's going to really kind of drive the adoption of AI in different companies. It was transformational for that program. It still is to this day. It's amazing what it's able to do.
Yeah, that was an outstanding example, Chris. And you're right. I don't know what the ultimate savings is up to now, but it is extraordinary, and it's a fraction of what it once was.
Yeah.
And it basically allows the organization to handle peak periods a lot better, because they can spool up these robots that essentially can do the adjudication work for the simple cases. And it's an extraordinary achievement.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of scratching the surface of what companies can do with AI. And what was interesting is I really think it's all about getting those killer use cases,
Yeah.
right? Where you can really kind of take stock of what you're doing, and whether it's time and motion studies, or
Yeah.
some basically study to understand what it's taking you to do some activity now, and then modeling it one step at a time using AI enabled processes, machine learning, etc. And then calculating the difference. And what's interesting is that skill of business case development is not really resident in IT organizations, right?
Yeah.
Because those guys are basically keeping the trains running, and they're moving a mile a minute, and they haven't necessarily built the business skills to do ROI analysis. And that's
Right.
really what this case, what this requires.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of goes back to the term governance. Within that contract, that the people working on that contract were motivated and dedicated to making that work once they kind of bought into it. But imagine trying to get a group of HR folks and finance folks and business development folks to adopt some new models while they're trying to do their day job. If you don't have the use cases properly thought out and put together, if you don't have your data clean, if you don't have people really bought in, you're gonna struggle. There's going to be a lot of failed implementations, I think, and until people realize exactly what needs to be done in order to make this stuff work.
Yeah.
Bob, I do want to kind of go off script here for just a second.
Go for it.
So I've got an idea, Chris. I'll kind of let you be the guinea pig here. So there are lots of people making predictions about what AI is going to be in the next 3, 5, 10 years. You've got the doomers that are talking Skynet. You've got people that are talking about the universal basic income, where the majority of the human population won't have to work. We'll just have basic income because AI and robots will be taking care of many of those things. You've got some people who think we'll have, like the Cortana from the Halo series, our own little personal AI that goes with us everywhere. I'd kind of like to give you a chance, if you've got 2 or 3 kind of predictions, bold or not, of AI. What do you think we'll see in the next 3 to 5 years?
I think you're going to see a period of kind of storming, so to speak, where AI is a disruptor, and there's going to be people that are going to resist it, and there's going to be people that are going to be zealots for it. But I eventually think it's going to evolve into an integral part of everyday life, whether it's in business or personal. It's going to be too powerful not. I don't necessarily believe in the doom and gloom aspects of Skynet. I think there's a lot of people that really kind of believe that. I think could that happen? Maybe, but I think there's enough. Smart people around it that are going to put that. We'll go back to the word governance. They're going to put the right controls in place where it's going to be used properly. But I do think we're going to go through a period of time where it's very disruptive, and there's going to be like religious wars on it. There's going to be people that are on the pro side and people on the negative side, and they're going to be very serious about what they believe in. But I think eventually it's going to normalize out because it's going to be too powerful not to. People are going to really start. Smart people are going to really start creating um, use cases and make it available to everyday folks for that's just going to improve their lives. Whether we get to a point where it's universal income and all the remedial repetitive task jobs are going to be replaced by robots. I don't know. Maybe I haven't really thought about it like that. I kind of think I'm more of an optimist, and then so I think it's going to be used I think it's going to be used in a beneficial way, but there's going to be some rough patches to get there. That's not really very specific, but or maybe a daring statement, but it's just kind of where I see it going. I think it's too powerful to not.
Good input. Yeah, Bob, I kind of think it'd be fun to, kind of get these and maybe even if we don't include them in the video, keep them to the side and come
Yeah.
back to them 2, 3, 4 years from now and just see
Yeah.
who was spot on.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was a great question,
That's a good
Tyler.
question.
I mean, I started thinking about Cortana and Skynet. And
Yeah.
We're at the
There's
perfect
one
time.
of the concepts in this book, Genesis, talks about these massive, complex AI models that potentially remove the ability of human thought or free will, and that the AI model potentially could start looking at humans as imperfect because they make bad decisions, and therefore they kind of shut down the ability for humans to make those decisions. That's the Skynet, doom and gloom aspect of it that they touch on. And the book, I want to be clear, the book's not saying that that's what's going to happen, but they kind of call upon, there are people out there. They describe that there are people out there that potentially do see that happening that way. I don't know that I don't necessarily know that it's going to be the rise of the machine, so to speak. But I think it's going to, in the end, be more beneficial to humanity versus detrimental.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting as I use various AI models, and there's so many out there, right, that you can use. I find it really challenging my thinking on a number of things, and I'll basically ask the AI to challenge my thinking. What am I assuming when I make this statement? And can you argue the opposite? I had another boss that actually made me do that, and I was very frustrated at first. But anyway, when you go through that kind of activity, I mean, there's a time where you basically basically burst a circuit and you can't think about it anymore.
Yeah.
Right? It's like too much challenge at one time.
Yeah.
Right. And you can go through it for a while, but then you have to take a break. Right.
Yep.
Because you can't constantly be challenging those assumptions all the time.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know if you've had any experiences like that, so.
I have, that's an interesting idea. And I think I want to try that. I want to go in and kind of put in a theory and say, why do you think I'm not correct on this? I've not tried that before, but that's kind of a cool idea. But what you talked about is definitely talked about in this book. You talked about just your brain gets tired after a while, and that's exactly what they said. We're kind of, and we're just talking about challenging ourselves by something in Chat GPT. Think about these brilliant scientists who are kind of just bumping up the way they describe in the book, they're bumping up against the capacity at which their human brain can comprehend these very complex scenarios and outcomes and things like that, and they'll never crack that nut without the aid of AI. And the human brain just doesn't possess that kind of processing power, is kind of what one of the scenarios that they describe. But it's interesting. Buckle up, because I think the next 10 years with AI is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that make you glad that you're retired now, Chris? That you don't have to deal with all that?
Yes and no, because it would be really cool to be able to bring AI into a company and really transform the company by using AI. That said, so that part I miss. The part I don't miss is the cultural aspects and the governance aspects and getting people to buy into it and fund it and do things the right way. Because my worry and my worry for those that are still in the business is that they're gonna they're going to really kind of bang their heads against the wall by trying to bring something in without really properly preparing for it. And the problem is, if it was only up to a CIO or a technology leader to prepare for it, that's no big deal. But that CIO or technology leader is dependent on other parts of the business preparing as well and diving in. And that's where it's going to be a little bit interesting with some companies and where they're going to kind of hit a brick wall.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
All right. So advice and rapid insights, Chris. So yeah. So what career advice would you give to someone who's just starting out in technology and is aspiring to, become a CIO someday?
The career advice I would give anybody, whether you're in technology or not, it kind of goes back to the pivot point in my career that we talked about early on. I was really hesitant to push myself out of my comfort zone. But had I not, my career probably would have gone a whole different direction. Whether I would have been as successful or not, who knows? But I know that if I hadn't done that, or unless somebody's not willing to do that, they're going to limit their opportunities, I guess is the best way of saying it. You could be successful without going out of your comfort zone, but I think if you push yourself out of your comfort zone and try different things and fail on some and be successful on others, I think that's how you really grow and develop your abilities, whether it's leadership or technology or otherwise. So it's cliche, but that's what I would tell people, that only based on my own personal use, is like, don't be afraid to screw up, to step into something that you're not comfortable with and screw up.
Chris, if you could start your career over again with a lot of the knowledge you've built over your career, is there anything that you would do differently?
That's a good question. I wonder if I'd be an architect today if I had kind of planned about that. This is hard to do because it's hard for any 18-year-old coming out of high school, going to college, or late teens, early 20s. My priorities back then were totally different than my priorities even 10 years later when I got married. But back then my focus wasn't doing the right things to put the right base in place so I could have a great career. My priorities back then, right, wrong, or indifferent, were when's my next paycheck and what am I going to do with my buddies this weekend? It was kind of a means to an end. But that, as I personally, as I matured and priorities change, and you get married, you start having a family, then your priorities change a lot. A lot of your career choices not only are driven by what you want to do and what you're interested in, but they're driven by being able to provide for your family and providing a stable home life. And so if I had to start over again, it's easy for me to say maybe I would focus less on where are we going to go have some beers this weekend, as opposed to what's really the right thing I can do to improve myself from a career perspective. I probably wasted a good 3 or 4 years of my first 3 or 4 years and not trying to do my best at my job, but more or less just getting through the day and going and having fun. And that's, if I had to do it over again, I'd probably try to do a little less of that. But I don't know how typical that is these days of folks coming out of school, but I'm sure there's probably some that still think that. There's probably others that are, because there was back when I was that age, there were some that really weren't focused on that. They were focused on really doing a good job and being successful in their careers. I just wasn't. It took me a while to kind of get into that mindset. And so if I had to do it over again, I'd probably try to get into that mindset a little earlier in my career.
That makes 2 of us.
I think there's several people like that. But there's probably just as many that were probably focused in the right areas. It took us a little longer. That's all.
Yeah. I'm curious. I mean, especially when I think about the cybersecurity challenge that you went through, and then I saw some of the things that you dealt with when you were my CIO, and I'm wondering how you deal with burnout and how you'd suggest people deal with burnout.
Yeah, that's a great question. If I had the answer to that, I might still be working today. I tried to deal with it, and I think I dealt with it pretty well by kind of compartmentalizing it and just I would get energized. I would get re-energized by things that would happen around the office, about things that we'd be successful on and things like that. But in the end, my burnout wasn't necessarily, and I'll totally transparent with you guys. One of the reasons I retired a little bit early, I had always planned to work until I was 60, and then I was going to retire. And I retired at 57 and a half. And the main reason is I was really burned out at the time, and I just didn't want to go start over somewhere else for the next couple of years. And I was in a position where I was able to, so I decided to just retire early. But my burnout wasn't because of the day-to-day grind. I guess it was because of the day-to-day grind, but the situation was, we had gone through COVID. That was really hard for technology teams, and managing the full remote of a company in a very short amount of time. We had gone through 3 acquisitions, and we did acquisitions, in my mind, we did acquisitions the right way at Serco. We didn't buy a company and then leave it outboard. We bought a company and we brought it in. And so there was lots of migrations and things like that. And with any acquisition, and I've been through a lot of them. When I worked at CSE, we did lots of acquisitions. And so I know this happens. There's a lot of churn that happens during acquisitions, especially for the people being acquired, because it's such a change for them. It's not bad. It's just, it's nature. And you get a lot of complaints and a lot of things. And so, the COVID, the 3 acquisitions, a refresh of the whole back office. We were going through refreshes of not the whole back office, but large portions of our back office. We were, as you know, Bob, because you were in the trenches with me, and that we're implementing new systems and putting them up in the cloud and things like that. And on top of that, you layer on the fact that you just hope you're plugging the holes of all the cybersecurity vulnerabilities that you have at the same time. And so that's, all that is kind of what culminated in me deciding to finally I just need to kind of remove myself, because I was really burned out. But if I were to look back and give somebody advice now, I think it's, as hokey as this sounds, I got through a lot of it because I did things to try to deal with my stress. And I still do them today, but I do them for different reasons. Like over COVID, I kind of dove into, exercising and eating right and things like that. And as silly as it sounds, I think that had a huge impact on my stress levels. And I can kind of credit my daughter at the time, who was an athlete in college, and she was very focused on that. She still is today. And during COVID, she came back home to live with us, and she kind of put all of my wife and I both on that track. So I think that helps a lot, because you're going to run into those kind of issues at work. The issues at work aren't going to go away. It's how you kind of compartmentalize them and kind of get past them and deal with quick wins. And you have to kind of do things outside of the office that will let your mind take a break. It's efforts to put your phone down for a while, efforts to not continually be a slave to your email, when you're at home or on weekends and things like that. If you're not taking those kind of breaks, it's really hard to kind of manage the burnout.
Yeah, that's a great comment, Chris, because when you were talking, it made me think about, and I don't know who said this, but it's a quote, but like everything affects everything else, right? And then when you start working on, your physical body, exercise, and taking breaks, as counterintuitive as that seems, right, and taking a break from your phone and the texting and the Slack and blah blah blah, right, the email and the constant churn of all these devices really can help you become more healthy at the end.
Absolutely. Agreed. I took, it's kind of sad, but I think this probably is the same for lots of people out there. I think it was May of 20, I guess it was May of 22. I took a 2-week vacation with my family, and we went overseas, and it was the first vacation in my entire 35-year career where I didn't bring my laptop, completely disconnected. And I think the only reason I did that was because at that point, well, the general public at Serco didn't know this. I had already talked with my boss. My boss knew I was retiring, and we already were putting the plan together. So I was like, I'm retiring at the end of this year. I'm not bringing my laptop. But, Tyler, you were asking me again if I had to do something over, what would I do? that's one of the things I'd probably try to do. And I would tell people now, when you take a vacation, it's really easy to say, I have to take my laptop in case something happens, or I have to take a laptop for whatever. Just don't take your laptop. And because I mean, that doing things like that will really help you recharge. It's easier said than done. Like I said, for 35 years, I took my laptop every time. And believe me, I went through the same thought process saying, well, do I need to bring my laptop? Nah, I'll put it in the car just in case. And invariably, you have it there and you're in this habit. And so, you open it up and you're sitting in, at the beach and you're spending an hour a day in email just trying to stay ahead of your email so you don't have 500 unread messages when you come back after 5 days. It's, problems are still going to be there when you get back. And I would, if I were to do it over again, I really would try harder to take real vacations and not worry about that kind of stuff.
Well, Chris, we've covered a lot of different topics here today. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to, have a discussion on, or any advice, insights, anything else?
No, I don't think so. But I really enjoyed this. I like having these discussions. I'm coming from a different place, kind of looking back at my career as opposed to being still in the middle of it. I probably would, if I was still in the middle of my career, I might have answered things a lot differently. But it's actually really nice, to be honest with you. I have no regrets of retiring early, and my wife and I are really enjoying it. Like I said, we're selling our house. We're getting ready to head to Europe for a while, and I really appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to come on and chat with you guys. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Congratulations on the retirement. Hope you enjoy your trip.
Thank you.
Yeah, Chris, thanks for coming on. It was really really an insightful conversation, and I've rarely seen you so relaxed as you are today.
Yeah,
it's really great. It's great. It's great.
Yeah, it is great. It's great. And it took a long time to get to this position. Like I said earlier, if I can help people who are currently in the middle of it figure out a way to be less stressed with some of the insights I have now, and in the perspective of looking back, I love to have those conversations and try to help people kind of navigate through it. Because if you're 40 years old and you're in the middle of your career and you're wound up like a top because everything's so stressful, you can't just retire. Right? I wouldn't have been able to do that when I was at that age as well. So if I can kind of take some of the wisdom that I have now and kind of impart it on folks to help them get through that a little better, I love doing that stuff.
Awesome. Well, we'll have to do another one of these from the coast of Spain, or something like that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It'd be a lot of fun. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Take care, guys. Yep. Bye-bye.